This is the David Pearce lecture. I want to say a couple of words about him. It's 20 years since he passed away, can you imagine? 2005. And everyone who experienced David has a little vignette about him, and here's mine. I did my master's program with him in 95. I did a PhD with him in 2000. In 2003, we had some consultancy where I was asked with Phoebe and Cameron Hepburn to summarize Christian Gollier's work on declining discount rates. 3 months later, that was in the Green Book, cost-benefit guidelines for the UK Treasury. That's kind of how it worked. And from there, that has been the mainstay of my career, working on social discounting, trying to improve cost-benefit analysis. It's been a long journey that's brought me, a privileged journey that's brought me here. And one of the great privileges of having this job is that I get to introduce to all my friends and colleagues amazing academics who have come to talk to you. And today I want to introduce you to Catherine Wolfram. She's the William Barton Rogers Professor of Energy and a Professor in Applied Economics at MIT Sloan School. And you'll know her for her work on energy economics and climate pricing. In energy economics, it ranges from RCTs in rural Kenya to administrative data in Accra, looking at poor voltage and the welfare effects of that. She works on climate pricing and is a real advocate for economic instruments to address climate change. She was appointed to the US Treasury as an advisor, particularly on climate change, under the Biden administration, I should add, to advise on climate change and energy economics. She's part of JPAL, and the recent work that we will all have been aware of that Catherine has done concerns the price cap, setting the price cap on Russian oil exports to prevent that flow of money that funds the illegal war in Ukraine. So today, I think the title of the presentation rather speaks for itself. We're going to hear about CBAM, we're going to hear about coalitions, we're going to hear about how climate policy is going to shape up in the current kind of situation. So please welcome the 2025 David Pearce Keynote, Professor Catherine Wolfram.
Great, thank you. This is on and working. So I'm going to start with an optimistic prediction, which is that 10 years from now, we will look back and think of the Trump election as transformative in a good way for global climate policy. I don't put 100%, well, it's okay. By the end of this talk, hopefully you will have changed your priors from 0% to something above 0%. I don't put it at 100%, but let me try to convince you that this might happen. So as Ben said, I wanted to give you a little perspective on how I'm coming at these thoughts and these issues. So as Ben said, I worked in the Biden administration at the Treasury, and every day I would walk basically down this path. I have all these pictures on my iPhone of the White House in the freshly fallen snow, the White House in the nice, fall colors. So I took this paper just before I started working on sanctions policy. As Ben said, I worked on the price cap, what became the price cap on Russian oil. And that caused me to think a lot about a couple of things. One was how government policy in one country can influence government policy in another country. So I'm going to be talking about that, not in the Russian oil context, but in the context of climate policy. And secondly, it led me to see how academic research can help shape economic policy. And so we'll talk about that in the climate context. And lastly, I got to see kind of international diplomacy in action. And that's helped me think about how climate policies come to be. So I also wanted to put in a bit of a plug for government service. I'll talk about this more at the end, especially for young people. This has just been a kind of transformative experience for me, and it really helped me see kind of how the sausage gets made, how economic policy can influence the sausage-making process. Okay, so basically, I took this from standing underneath the office that I used to sit in. We had these lovely views of the White House. Janet Yellen was down the hall from me. Now there are different members or different occupants of these buildings. We are in a Trump 2 world. What I want to do is start by talking about some of the things that Trump has done, and then talk about how kind of the U.S. climate policy relates to other countries. Then I'll talk a bit about the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, and I think that this has really been a transformative policy and has the potential to generate some positive momentum that I do think Trump's actions kind of like help that momentum along. So I will hopefully convince you of this. CBAM is not without its challenges. We'll talk about some of the objections to CBAM, particularly from low and middle income countries. And then I'm going to talk about some very kind of active policy work that I'm engaged in with colleagues right now, trying to like give this momentum a little bit of a boost and try to help it along. Okay, so what's going on in U.S. climate policy? You may have read these headlines. You know, Trump has done everything that he promised to do on the campaign trail. He's removed the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. It won't be official for a year after he announced it, but on day one, he announced that he would do that. He has removed some the U.S. actually did have a price on greenhouse gas emissions under the Biden administration. It was a price on methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. Trump and Congress have gotten rid of that. Even more than that, the lawyers who I talked to worry that that action is kind of the precursor to Trump trying to attack what's known as the endangerment finding, which was basically, you know, what gave the EPA the ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just kind of the beginning of what they're trying to do to undermine U.S. climate policy. Also, there were some regulations on transportation and on power plants. Those, there are kind of actions in place to try to get rid of those. And unfortunately, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration's signature climate policy, is now under attack in the U.S. Congress. So there are debates going on within the Senate now on reconciliation, and it looks like for fiscal reasons, a lot, or, you know, it depends who you talk to, whether it's a lot or just some, of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies are on the chopping block. So those are, you know, obviously very bad developments in the U.S., but I guess I would offer that climate policy has always been challenging in the U.S. And so if you hang out with EAERE members, you might think that all Americans are like the economists that come to those conferences, but that's not the case. More than half of the Americans that voted for Trump. And I do think that climate policy, and particularly carbon pricing, has always been challenging in the U.S. in a way that it hasn't in other countries. So this is a map of countries in the world that have some form of federal carbon price. You don't have to pay attention to the colors, but the countries that are colored are the countries that either have or have planned a carbon price. In the case of India, for instance, in Brazil, they are in the process of forming emissions trading systems, cap and trade systems. So you can look at this map and say, of all the G20 countries, 17 of them have some form of carbon price. The 3 that don't are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. So not good company for the U.S. And I think this, you know, this is one indication that the dynamics behind climate policy are particularly challenging in the U.S. Why might they be challenging? I think there are a couple reasons. You know, U.S. is in company of Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's not an accident. The U.S. is now the biggest oil and gas producer in the world. That's happened pretty quickly since the shale revolution, but it is now a fact. And together with that, together with the prominence of oil and gas, money plays a big role in politics in the U.S., thanks to the Citizens United decision in 2010. Before that, in 2008, the Republican candidate for president campaigned on a cap-and-trade program. So, I think over the last 15 years or so, things have gotten even more challenging for climate policy in the U.S. I think there's some other factors. I think the extreme polarization that we're seeing has led to kind of threats to carbon pricing. In my experience in D.C., I learned that the left hates carbon pricing, almost as much as the right, or maybe more than the right. And the right, the extreme right, doesn't want to say the word carbon or climate, basically. So these centrist policies, like carbon pricing, are particularly challenging in the U.S. And finally, there's been some speculation that because the U.S. is the reserve currency, we don't face the same fiscal constraints as other countries, so that makes carbon pricing even less attractive. These are all kind of, at this point, conjectures on my point. On my part, I would love to see more research on this if there are graduate students in the audience. I think these political economy issues and kind of making the case strongly that the U.S. is different from other countries could be useful. On that note, this was not academic research in the way that we think of it, but a recent article in Foreign Affairs basically said petrostate America and made the case that the U.S. is acting like a petrostate in the way that we, don't care about free trade in the same way that we did maybe 20 years ago. So this is an article by two political scientists. I liked it because I put the U.S. in the same category as Russia and Saudi Arabia. Yes, maybe the U.S. is acting like a petrostate. And so from that perspective, I think the fact that Trump has very clearly, very publicly withdrawn the U.S. from the climate stage really makes it clear to other countries that they need to step up, that they need to be leaders in this space. And I saw when I was in the administration working on sanctions policy that the U.S. is a leader. The U.S. shows up to the G7 and says something, and the other 6 countries or the other 6 jurisdictions kind of fall in line. That's not going to happen with climate, and the world needs to adjust to that. The U.S. has been a leader on multilateralism for a long time. The U.S. helped with setting up the UN, for instance. But on climate policy, I think the world needs to adjust to the fact that it's not going to work that way. And Trump has made it very clear that it's not going to work that way. So I think we need to think about ways that other countries can step up and other countries can show leadership. And what I'm going to argue is that one way they can do that is around carbon pricing. And removing the U.S. is going to make it easier to focus on carbon pricing, given the challenges that the U.S. faces on carbon pricing. I hope eventually that things come back and that if other countries are making progress on carbon pricing, a future Democratic administration will catch up, or that even Republican administrations will get pressure from industry, from multinational firms in the U.S., and will finally get to, and get fiscal pressure, and will finally get to the point where they think that carbon pricing makes sense. But this is the U.S. basically catching up with other countries. I think other countries need to lead. So luckily, we are starting to see that leadership, and some of that leadership is coming from the European Union. Some of that is coming in the form of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. It's this new policy. It's got kind of a funky acronym, but I think that it is potentially a very transformative policy. And I think it has the ability to kind of start this virtuous policy cycle. So to explain why I'm so enamored of the CBAM, I want to step you through a diagram that I've used with my MBAs. You're welcome if you're teaching climate policy, you're welcome to use this. I know it's a little dumbed down for this audience, but I think it does help make the point about how CBAM is really transformative and is helping us address the prisoner's dilemma associated with climate policy. So we're separating things into 2 actors just to keep things in the 2x2 matrix. We've got the U.S. making decisions about climate policy, the rest of the world. The decisions are whether to do a little climate policy or do a lot of climate policy, again, to keep things in the 2x2 matrix. And a colleague of mine teaching MBAs likes to not use numbers, but to use these icons. I kind of like the idea of the icons. And so you can see that the worst possible outcome, if you're the US, is to do a lot of climate mitigation, bear the expenses associated with subsidies, bear the political costs associated with carbon pricing, while the rest of the world does a little. The US, rounding, is about 10% of global emissions. If we do a lot, we halve our emissions, we reduce our emissions by 80%, the rest of the world does nothing, we're still going to confront the worst of climate change. The best possible outcome, by contrast, this is funky, is to free ride, to do a little while the rest of the world is doing a lot. The second best possible outcome is to have everyone do a lot, and where we're stuck now is everyone doing a little, because the similar incentives, similar payoffs are faced by the rest of the world. The rest of the world would like to do a little. If the US does a lot, that's where the smiley face is, and we're stuck kind of with the world's biggest prisoner's dilemma of climate change. And so what I want to show you, what I want to argue, is that the EU CBAM, in a way that no global climate policy to date has, really confronts the free rider problem associated with this prisoner's dilemma. So what is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism? Remember that the European Union has the emissions trading system. They have a price on carbon. It's about 75 euros per ton. So if you've got a steel producer in Europe, you've got to, say you emit 1 ton of carbon for every ton of steel, you've got to pay that carbon price. It has been the case that imports have not had to pay a carbon price, but starting January 1st, 2026, for these sectors, 5 sectors listed here, imports will start having to pay a carbon price. So if you're a steel producer in Malaysia, say, you take 2 tons of carbon to make a ton of steel, you'll have to pay 150 euros per ton of steel that you import. But the key thing with the CBAM is that they will credit imports for any carbon price they've already paid domestically. So for instance, if that Malaysian steel producer represented there, if they'd already paid 10 euros per ton, then their CBAM reduces from 75 down to 65 because they're credited for that 10 euros that they've already paid in Malaysia. And so countries are doing the calculation in real time. If I put on my own carbon price, then maybe some of my producers who are exporting to the EU won't object because they're already paying the carbon price. They're just writing the check and sending it to Brussels. But if I put on a carbon price, I get to keep that revenue. So for instance, Turkey, 50% of their total manufacturing is exported to the EU. They've done that calculus, and they are implementing an ETS themselves in order to keep the domestic revenue. And their industry has not objected. They're not facing the political costs with that. And so, that's the beginning of this virtuous policy cycle that we could see from the CBAM because of the dynamics, because of kind of the policy impacts of the EU decision on other countries' decisions. It's not just Turkey that's doing that. Brazil, the leaders of COP30, the hosts of COP30 this year, have announced their plans to implement an emissions trading system. China is a huge producer. It's 50% of global aluminum, 60% of global steel. They recently, in March of this year, expanded their carbon price to cover 3 of the 4 CBAM sectors. I'm ignoring electricity on CBAM because it's kind of, just a little bit of electricity that comes into the EU from Morocco. But the 4 remaining CBAM sectors, aluminum, steel, cement, and fertilizer, when you count the electricity associated with those, are more than 20% of global emissions. So the fact that China is pricing carbon is a huge step. It's not a super high price on carbon yet, but hopefully, given some of the things that I'll talk about at the end of the lecture, China can get to a point where it's more ambitious. Another recent development, is that the UK and the EU are now talking about merging their ETS, their cap and trade programs. Part of that is because they wanted not to have to be paying. The UK is also thinking about a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and they didn't want to have to, kind of account for each other's carbon prices and deal with the administrative complexity of paying one another CBAM. So they're thinking about unifying their markets. From a Econ 101 perspective, that's a step towards where we want to end up with a global carbon price. If we have kind of interlocked or interrelated carbon pricing markets, maybe Brazil, China could eventually join that progress between the U.S. or the EU and the UK. So that's a direction. That's where we want to go. I have some work so those are examples. China, when they expanded their ETS, didn't cite the EU CBAM, but I think the fact that 3 of the 4 sectors are the CBAM sectors is an indication that the CBAM had something to do with it. So I have a policy brief that came out in the fall of last year that basically counted countries that had started carbon pricing since the EU started talking about the CBAM. So in red, there are 11 countries that have enacted carbon prices. There are over 40 countries that are talking about carbon prices or have some form of kind of formal process around carbon prices. So, we are seeing this momentum start to build. Coming back to the prisoner's dilemma, the thing that the CBAM does, as I said, is takes on the free rider problem directly. So go back to the payoff to the U.S. when it does a little and the rest of the world does a lot. Before, that was a big smiley face, right? That's the free rider problem. Now, if the U.S. is left doing a little and the rest of the world does a lot, particularly Canada, Mexico, imagine they have carbon prices, they have CBAMs, the U.S. isn't going to be as happy. The U.S. is exporting and sending checks to Ottawa, sending checks to Mexico City. The U.S. starts looking, kind of silly in that perspective. And so it's, a little bit optimistic, but I'm replacing those smiley faces with frowny faces, because if you're left as the one country that's doing a little, everyone else is doing a lot, and everyone else is imposing border adjustments, then you are paying the price. So we're left here with a coordination problem. It's much easier to solve coordination problems and get to the good equilibrium than it is to solve the prisoner's dilemma. So that's why I'm so enthusiastic about the CBAM, and that's why I think we should all be cheering for this kind of global momentum that the CBAM is bringing. I have some formal work with several co-authors that looks at the aluminum and steel sectors. We have an equilibrium model with trade, free trade in these sectors, and we have very good data, kind of aluminum smelter level data and steel plant level data from the aluminum and steel sector, and show, you can look at the dotted line, that's what happens in high income countries when there's no CBAM, so that's the sum of government revenues, consumer surplus, and producer surplus. And what you see is that the free rider problem is less stark. The blue line that's solid is below the dotted blue line, indicating that, yes, the free rider problem is less of an issue when you have the CBAM. The orange line there is the welfare associated with a global carbon price, so trying to think about, well, do we see these kind of positive dynamics bearing out? And so the orange line is positive, meaning that the high-income countries definitely benefit from having a CBAM, but it's not above the blue lines. until you start to add the value of carbon reductions. And so just at like a $10 a ton carbon reduction, you can make having a global carbon price pay off for countries. Similarly, for low-income countries, the blue line, the solid blue line, is below the dashed blue line, indicating that the free rider problem is addressed with the CBAM. The orange line in this case is negative, but it's not like strongly negative. That's only $1 billion at dollar per ton price on carbon. Again, if you add the benefits, even just thinking about the local benefits of addressing climate change, that becomes positive and hopefully bigger than the lines with no taxes. Okay, so those are the good things about CBAM. Those are the ways in which it addresses the free rider problem. There are definitely challenges associated with CBAM, and I would say one of the biggest challenges has been the perception, at least, that CBAM threatens the low and middle income countries. So here are just a snapshot of headlines that have come out recently about CBAM. This says, the India is seeking exemption from the UK carbon tax from the UK's version of the CBAM. South Africa is saying that the carbon tax is just not just, and they're going to object at the WTO. The Center for Global Development came out with a study that suggested that for Mozambique, CBAM would lead to a 2% reduction in their total GDP. Mozambique is a very poor country and is a very big exporter of aluminum to the European Union. So the Center for Global Development is calculating that that's going to lead to a 2% reduction in the CBAM. I'm going to get to this. The Center for Global Development is doing a couple things that I think could be changed. One, it's assuming that Mozambique's aluminum is as dirty as the average aluminum. It's not accounting for the fact that Mozambique's aluminum is in fact quite clean. And secondly, it's not allowing Mozambique to react to the CBAM and not allowing Mozambique to impose its own carbon tax if it makes sense to, which I will argue that it does make sense to. So kind of to summarize this critique or these critiques of CBAM, one phrase I've heard that's quite poignant is that the CBAM is regulatory colonialism. This is the EU deciding what the carbon price should be, how we should be addressing climate change, and imposing that on the rest of the world. But I think that argument or those types of arguments don't address a couple of things. They don't address the fact that low and middle income countries can react themselves and can implement carbon prices which bring revenue to the countries. For instance, I've been working with the government of Mozambique. If Mozambique implements a $50 per ton just on their aluminum sector, it's basically a single taxable entity. It's not a very hard tax to administer. That will increase total fiscal revenues by 1.5%. So this is a lot of money for a poor country. The second thing that the critiques don't address is the fact that I think they assume that production in low and middle income countries is like, low productivity and high emissions. But what we found in our study of the aluminum and steel sectors is that is generally, that's sometimes the case, but that's not generally the case. So here we're plotting the emissions intensity at a country level on log GDP per capita. So I think the perception is that line should be very negatively sloped, that the high emitting plants are in the low and middle income country, and that the kind of cleaner, more technologically advanced plants are in the higher income countries. But in fact, in the case of steel, we see that the line is upward sloping. In the case of aluminum, it's downward sloping, but it's certainly quite noisy. It's not statistically significantly negative. And there are countries, Mozambique is that dot there. Mozambique, as I've indicated, is quite clean. And so I think at least there will be a heterogeneous impact of CBAM on on low and middle income countries. So again, kind of going to Econ 101, why do I think that this could benefit Mozambique in addition to the carbon price revenue that they could gain? So let's think about a simple supply and demand scenario that represents the aluminum market without a CBAM. So there's one single world price. I've represented the EU market separate from the rest of the world market because once we introduce the CBAM, they're going to be separate markets. But we have supply and demand curves in the EU, supply and demand curves in the rest of the world. What the CBAM does is essentially adds a new cost, right? It starts taxing carbon for all producers when they supply into the EU market. And so you can represent that as a rotation of the supply curve. Why a rotation? Because some firms have lower carbon emissions than other firms. And in fact, Mozambique, as I've indicated already, is quite low. So Mozambique is down here. So yes, Mozambique's costs will go down, but not as much as the green premium will go up for selling into the European market. And so this makes the point that, yes, Mozambique should be continuing to export, not diverting its exports away from the European market, but continuing to export to the EU. It will start earning a green premium, that the company will. And if the Mozambican government imposes its own carbon price, it can reap the revenues associated with that. The other thing to notice is that Mozambique is a low-income country. They are exporting like 99% of their aluminum. They are not consuming much aluminum domestically, and so domestic consumers will not be bearing any costs associated with that carbon price. So that's the way in which we think that this narrative that CBAM is bad for low and middle income countries is not reflective of the diversity of experiences that are confronted by low and middle income countries, nor is it reflective of the fact that low and middle income countries can react to CBAM. They don't just have to kind of accept it. They can react to it by imposing their own carbon price. Okay, so, this is all like at a somewhat theoretical level. Yes, the CBAM can lead to this positive feedback cycle. Yes, it seems like there are objections or there are reasons to be suspicious of the critiques that are being waged at CBAM. But what I've done is, together with colleagues, tried to give this a little bit of, momentum, a little bit of oomph. And so colleagues and I have proposed what we're calling a heavy industry climate coalition. In particular, what we're talking about is kind of a variant on CBAM, but not exactly like CBAM. We're saying, why don't we develop a coalition of countries? We can talk about what countries might be part of that coalition. Imagine countries that already have carbon prices. You could put Canada, Australia, UK, EU, Brazil, India, China. Those are all countries that are pricing carbon emissions or will be pricing carbon emissions in the future for these heavy industries. So let's focus on those heavy industries for now. So it's no lift to get those countries to impose carbon prices. It's just that we need to get them to have some kind of agreement to recognize one another's carbon prices. And maybe the way we want to recognize one another's carbon prices, at least in the beginning, is to recognize the principle that the COP process has endorsed around common but differentiated responsibilities. So maybe we should let low-income countries into the coalition charging a lower carbon price than high-income countries. So, for instance, the IMF has come out in 2021 with a proposal for a graduated carbon price with 3 bins: low-income, middle-income, high-income, and the low-income could charge 1/3 the price that the high-income countries could. What that would mean is that if you were exporting from a low-income country to the EU, you would be credited at 3x whatever your carbon price was. So if India is exporting to the EU with the 25 euro per ton carbon price, they would be credited and they would be exempt from the 75 euro per ton CBAM. So you could you could think about these as dials that are things that policymakers could negotiate over. Maybe the high-income countries wouldn't be super comfortable having the discounted carbon prices for the low-income countries last forever. Maybe they'd be worried about, leakage continuing even with a positive but lower carbon price. And so maybe you could think about phasing out those graduated carbon prices over time and making the carbon prices equalize over time. These are things that, we would hope that policymakers could get together and discuss. We also think that it's important to marry the sticks associated with carbon prices together with carrots. And so you can think about, for instance, technology transfer agreements. You could think about, for instance, having pilot projects on low emission clean steel that the World Bank helps fund in low-income countries that are part of this coalition. So that would be an additional inducement in addition to the lower carbon price, an additional inducement to join the coalition. You could think about having agreements that remove trade barriers on essential elements of clean technology. So, that would make people feel more comfortable to join the coalition if China said, we're not going to hold you up on rare earth minerals. And finally, you could think about using some of the revenues from the carbon pricing to fund climate finance. So transfers from high-income countries to low-income countries using the carbon pricing revenues. So what are the incentives to join such a climate coalition? I think from the EU's perspective, there is still some concern that the CBAM will unravel, that the objections to it, like I highlighted on the slide with the headlines, will take root, that there'll be objections at the WTO. So I think some form of coalition will give the EU the comfort and the encouragement that the CBAM is really having these beneficial effects and has led countries to increase their climate ambitions and join the coalition. China, I think, has strong incentives to join the coalition. I think, most practically, they are investing heavily in the clean energy transition. They're huge producers of solar, huge producers of electric vehicles. They want other countries to come along and to be more ambitious, not just for climate reasons, but for kind of the ability to sell their clean technologies abroad. Brazil is an important actor here because they are hosting COP30 this year. We think Brazil's incentives to join a coalition like this are they would get exemption from the CBAM at a lower price, and they would get access to climate finance and tech transfer if those are part of the coalition. So this is not, not just theoretical. Colleagues and I, including Sam, have formed a coalition, a working group to put forward what a coalition could look like, to help policymakers think clearly about what a coalition could look like. Let me just highlight a couple of the members of the working group in addition to Sam. So we have Frank Jotzo from Australia. Frank led the commission there that advised the government to implement a CBAM themselves. Australia is also potentially the host of COP31, and so kind of an important player and the hopes that this idea takes hold and continues. Jennifer Winter is from Canada. Mark Carney recently became Prime Minister of Canada, campaigned on a CBAM. So they are thinking about CBAMs. We have 2 representatives from China, 2 from the EU. We have representatives from Indonesia, from Thailand. Imagine a coalition that includes just like India, China, the EU, Brazil, Canada. It's a lot of emissions. And if it covers these heavy industries, 20% of global emissions, that's again a lot of emissions. So I hope I've convinced you that I think there's some probability that not having the US at the table makes it easier to focus on carbon pricing and makes it easier for other countries to come together, makes it easier to put things in place that will hopefully at some point nudge the U.S. in the right direction. But the U.S. does need that nudging. All right, so let me conclude, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Hopefully you'll come back at me with some of the cynicism. Let me conclude with a couple of what I think of as more suggestions, especially for graduate students and younger people in the room. I think it's important. Everyone thinks it's important to work on the same things that they're working on. So let me just stipulate that. But I think it's important to think about kind of the global geopolitical aspects of climate change. I think we can get focused on kind of what we know and what we can get data on, which is our own country's emissions and our own country's policies. But 80% of the world lives in a low and middle income country. So it's super, super important to think about how our policies will translate into reductions in that 80% of the population, for that 80% of the populations. I also think, and I will say this to a room full of economists more clearly than I might say it to a different room, I also think that the global process to date, the COP process, has been dominated by lawyers. So it's been dominated by the ministries of energy, by the ministries of environment, the ministries of foreign affairs. Those people are primarily lawyers. Lawyers love words, and lawyers are really good at words. And so we get out of the COPs kind of these like statements, right? That the world agrees to phase down or phase out, whatever it is, fossil fuels. Those are important for sure. But it's also important to think about economic incentives. It's also important to think about incentive compatibility. You know, do these words lead to actions that countries will stick to? And so I think it's super important for economists to be part of these conversations and for economic research to be informing those conversations. Secondly, I do think that the evidence base that research brings is super important. I saw that when I was a policymaker, but I also think that it's important to take the next step and try to make that research much more accessible to policymakers. So do things like we're trying to do with the committee and like lay out step by step what policymakers could do to form a coalition. So I used to think, before I went to government, I used to think that there was this like huge network of like huge apparatus of policymakers, right? And that the economics profession was kind of this like upstart small band of people. We had to teach, we had to apply for grants, and sometimes we would like generously write a blog post and make our work accessible to policymakers. I now think that it's completely flipped, that there's this small group of policymakers who have a million things on their plate. Like, think about my former boss, Janet Yellen. She is one person. She has to go to the dentist. But she also had to deal with, like, the debt crisis in the U.S., the Silicon Valley bank implosion, financial sanctions, the Inflation Reduction Act. Oh, and like the whole U.S. macroeconomy. And she is one person. She's being called, you know, Saturday night at 2 a.m. and being told something is happening in the world. It's an incredibly responsible job, an incredible amount of things that are coming across your desk at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So I think that we as researchers have the luxury to kind of help policymakers and lay out step by step what policymakers can do. Finally, I'd suggest that we keep a sense of scale. As I said, 80% of the world lives in low and middle income countries. So let's think about, you know, what are the tons that our work might influence? What are the global impacts of our research? So thank you very much. I look forward to the comments and the questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. That was incredible, and it would definitely have blown David Pearce's mind to see how advanced we've got in this respect. So let's have some questions. First hand was just up there, actually.
Thanks a lot for the clear, pragmatic, and also hopeful outlook. I was wondering, the idea of shifting from a prisoner's dilemma to a coordination problem with the CBAM works on the import side, but as CBAM does not foster for exporters, for obvious reasons, as WTO would not allow for that, isn't it implicitly assuming that all the other countries or beyond the EU will enlarge to also introduce not only a carbon price but also a CBAM system? Then it definitely becomes just a coordination problem. And wouldn't the idea of a graduated carbon price make that more unlikely, increase the problem of exporters that have a carbon price?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. A couple of responses. The EU has not yet written the regulations on what they will recognize, but it seems likely that they will not recognize a carbon price just on exports, but they will require there to be a carbon price on all aluminum. Like, you can't just tax the exports of your aluminum. You have to tax all your aluminum, even the stuff for domestic consumption. But I think what you're also maybe getting at is we're only talking about traded goods here. We're not talking about the other 80% of the emissions, things like transportation, which are not traded and can't be affected by a CBAM. No, not that either.
Refund, a full CBAM would mean a refund for exports.
Oh, that's right. But okay, that's not what the CBAM is. They're not refunding exports in the EU. Yes, to really address leakage, you might want a refund, but that's not what they're doing in the EU. The other thing that your question brings up, I'm not sure you were asking this, but there's a question in the coalition with the graduated price. If you have a low-income country that's out of the coalition, do you CBAM them at the low price or do you CBAM them at the high price? We're not taking a stand on that. You might think for fairness reasons you should CBAM them at the low price, but you might think for incentive reasons you should CBAM them at the high price. It's a question that policymakers can decide.
Very inspiring, Catherine. I have a question regarding free allocation. So free allocation has the same effect on emissions. It's also politically easier, but in competitiveness effects, you might still have competitiveness effects, and Europe might still be afraid of losing market share. What do you think is the optimal rule for free allocation? And would that maybe also be a contender in this favorable regime for low-income countries?
Yeah, great question. So right now the EU has plans to phase out their free allocations gradually. It's quite gradual in the beginning. So the EU CBAM starts January 1st, 2026, but only 2.5% of the free allocations are gone. So the CBAM is going to phase in very slowly, especially up to 2030. So I actually think that there's some really interesting, knotty work to be done to think about how you compare the EU ETS with the free allocations to the Chinese ETS, where it's basically an intensity-based standard. I think there's some analogs between those two systems. The Chinese intend to transition from an intensity-based standard to a mass-based standard, so to an ETS that is more like the European ETS. But I think there's some interesting calculations and design decisions that economists could have a lot to say about on how you get some kind of equivalence between the EU with its free allocations and other ETS systems. So it's something that the working group report that we're writing right now isn't going to address, but hopefully if this gets laid, that's something that a future working group could weigh in on.
Maybe say who you are and as well before you...
Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Marie-Catherine Rico from Kiel University. Thank you very much for the inspiring talk. I was wondering, because you talked about this narrative, this kind of try to counteract this kind of positive policy cycle. So what's your experience in their role in the political process to actually influence the outcome? So will kind of the facts dominate in the end, or could it be this like concerns that may actually not be based on facts?
So like how do policymakers make decisions and how, I mean, politics are real. I do think that, like, somebody once said to me, one of the best things you could say to a politician is you don't want to look silly or you don't want to look stupid, right? And so I think something like a CBAM is like the idea that your producers are sending checks to other governments and you could take a policy decision that would keep those checks domestic, like that's kind of the no-brainer that policymakers respond to. So yeah, it's challenging. I'm sure there are lots of other considerations. There are, strategic, other geopolitical concerns that are at play here. I don't want to minimize the difficulties there, but within the climate context, I do think that things like this, can have legs. I guess the other thing that I'll say is some people say, we tried carbon pricing with Kyoto, but that was many, many years ago, right? That was 1990s, and so many more people and politicians themselves are experiencing climate change. So I think like things can happen now because of this sensitivity to climate change that couldn't have happened even 15 years ago.
We have a question at the back.
I'm Patrick Bear from the World Bank. You said, you gave an example, you said, what would it look like if, sorry.
Okay, there you are, thank you.
What would it look like if Canada and Mexico had a CBAM and the U.S. was left out? That trade relationship is already governed by the USMCA, so how would a CBAM fit into that? And like, how do you see, if the U.S. didn't like that Canada and Mexico had a CBAM, could they use the USMCA as a cudgel to get them to pull out?
Okay, so the Trump administration is completely ignoring the USMCA now. I don't know enough about kind of free trade agreements to give you a concrete answer to that question, but I guess I think that something like this, something like this that addresses climate change should be a reason. If the USMCA gets in the way of this, let's renegotiate the USMCA to allow for that. I mean, I also, like, as I said, Trump is ignoring the USMCA, but I do think that Trump's kind of very belligerent attitude towards tariffs is yet another reason that a coalition is attractive to countries. Because what Trump would most like to do, and we're seeing this with the lawyers, we're seeing this with the universities, Trump wants to have individual bilateral negotiations, right? He does not want a coalition against him. But if China and Mexico are part of a coalition on climate that says you cannot reduce your tariffs on the U.S., otherwise you'll be kicked out of the coalition, and then your exports will be subject to border adjustments, I think that strengthens people's hands and makes it easier for them to negotiate with Trump.
We have a question up there on the right.
Hello. Actually, my first question is quite related to what you were mentioning now, and whether you consider or think that actually the US and Trump could retaliate against the CBAM if there is this coalition of countries with the US left out or like not willing to join, whether Trump would respond to that with a general tariff on all imports to those countries as
like a 10% tariff or something,
yes,
like he's
exactly.
already doing, yeah.
And then I have a second question on the CBAM on low-income countries, whether instead of implementing a lower CBAM on these countries, we could recycle the revenue from the CBAM part back to these countries to support the development of abatement policies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And on your first question, it's kind of contradicts what I said to the last interviewer or the last questioners, but I also think that there's a way that this coalition could kind of fly under Trump's radar. This is technical. It's got a funky acronym. The U.S. does not export aluminum and steel to a first approximation. I mean, if Canada and Mexico did it on aluminum and steel products, that would get their attention. But I think if this could kind of gather momentum over the next 3 years and then like really become a thing in 2029, that would be awesome. Sorry, and the second question was about CBAM revenues. The thing about CBAM revenues, especially with a pretty broad coalition, CBAM revenues aren't that big. So you need to start tapping into the carbon pricing revenues for the climate finance. But the carbon pricing revenues are quite significant.
Right, we have 2 more up here. Can everyone hear, by the way? Yeah, I think it's switched on.
Thanks. So Lisa Ryan, University College Dublin. Thanks for the presentation. And I guess my question is, I'm interested in the focus on lower and middle income countries, and I agree that that's where we should be focusing a lot more on it. I was just wondering, from a position of ignorance, those countries, steel, aluminium, those productions, are they usually multinational companies that are there, or are they really locally produced? So if you were to think about discounting the tariff on those countries, but if it's really multinationals that are there that are actually European or American companies in the first place, how would you think about that? Because they're probably, they're there in the first place for lower cost production, but they're not really local Mozambique companies, for example, or should they be treated all the same, or how have you started thinking about that?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of richness to that question. I don't know, it's not mostly multinational, but there are definitely some multinational, and it varies by country. So like India has a lot of domestically owned steel, Tata Steel, JSW Steel. Mozal, the Mozambique aluminum plant, is owned by an Australian conglomerate. So yes, it's a high-income country multinational that owns it. That said, I think there's an argument for giving them preference, especially if it's in the form of a lower carbon tax and not just like allowances that we're transferring to Mozal, because those might be appropriated by the Australian shareholders, essentially. But if we're giving cheap, like a low carbon tax to Mozambique, that favors production in Mozambique, and then that favors job creation in Mozambique, right? Mozambique has lots and lots of hydro potential that they could develop. And so, if they're faced with a lower carbon price, they could expand their production of aluminum and get the jobs associated with that. So these are, they're heavy industry. They are not super labor intensive, but they are building aluminum factories, staffing aluminum factories are good jobs in Mozambique. So there are definitely people that are talking about kind of clean industrialization as a way for Africa to grow.
We have a question here, and we'll take one more after that, but it better be a crisp, well-formulated.
And I will try to.
No pressure on you.
Hi, this is Stefano Clo from the University of Florence. So the starting point of your very inspiring speech is that the EU can be a global climate leader. It starts by unilaterally putting a carbon price, and then through a CBAM it can favor international cooperation and convergence toward the EU policy. I see another potential scenario, a worst-case scenario, is that the fact that climate policy requires political and democratic support, but they are costly. And nowadays in Europe, there is a lot of discontent, political discontent. So while the US was, thanks to the shale revolution, is the world fossil fuel producer and exporter, we are still in the middle of energy crisis, and the EU electorate is moving toward the right. And so I see the risk in another scenario where the the world is moving toward Trump. And it's hard to see nowadays, especially this word of international cooperation. So how do you speculate about that?
Gosh. No, I think that's I think that's a risk. I guess if you just have the CBAM as the EU, then you've solved the competitiveness problem for aluminum and steel, but you have not solved the competitiveness problem for cars, right, for the downstream industries. But with a coalition, if you have lots of countries, like Japan becomes part of the coalition, and then they also have slightly higher priced aluminum, then you have addressed the competitiveness problem for cars. So I think there's a way in which the coalition kind of makes it easier from a competitiveness perspective for the EU. That might not be a completely satisfactory answer. I do myself worry about kind of sliding towards the right. And at that point, I think lots of climate policy is threatened. But I think this, if anything, helps. I don't think it helps mitigate against that slide. I don't think it pushes us towards that slide.
Okay, I think that might be a good place to wrap it up. I don't see any more hands up, so let's put our hands together for
Thank you. Thank you.